Hi, my name is Bob Beechell, and in this particular video I'm going to be looking at one of the key objects in R, and that's vectors. Now, a vector is a one-dimensional array or column of data. That data can be numeric, or it can be characters, text, or it can be in fact true or false values. Now, vectors are one of the main objects that you use in R, so it's important to understand how they work and how you can manipulate them. Now, a vector, of course, is a one-dimensional array of data. The data could be numeric, or it could be text, characters, or it could be logical values. Most of the vectors that you'll use when you're using R and RStudio will be the variables in your data set, which will be columns in your data frame. But you can create vectors manually too, and we need therefore to look at how to manipulate vectors and some of the operations that apply to them. So here I have some code here showing how to create a vector manually. Notice first of all the use of comments in our code. These comments begin with the hash sign. Now the next line here creates a vector, a numeric vector, a floating point 1, with 4 elements, 1.2, 3.4, 5.6 and 10.0. And that vector is assigned to a variable. Remember, of course, that all objects can be assigned to a variable so that they can be used later on. And this, of course, is the assignment operator, the less than sign followed by a minus sign. So the way to create a vector manually is to use this notation here, a little c, and in brackets the elements of the vector. Now if I want to run that command and create the vector, then I need to press here on the Mac Command Enter. On Windows it would be Control Enter. Pressing Enter simply moves the cursor down to another line. Now sometimes you want to do that because you want to enter a number of commands and then run them all in one go. So you don't always want to enter each command individually. But here I'm going to enter this command by pressing Command Enter. Here in the console I can see the results of running that command. It's repeated the comment, and then it's run the command to create the vector x. If I want to see what's in the variable x, then you simply type the variable name here, x, which is essentially the print command. What that does is print it to the console here. So let me run that. And here is the vector I've just created. What you see is the elements of the vector, and the 1 here in brackets here indicates the index of the first element in the row. Now vectors in R are indexed from 1 onward, not 0 as in the case with many programming languages, but from 1. So the 1.2 here is an index of 1, that's the first element, in other words. 3.4 is an index of 2, and so on. Now you can see, if you go down here to the environment pane, where you can see the objects you've created, here we have this variable x, this vector, the numeric vector. Notice it tells me that it's a numeric vector with 4 elements, indexed from 1 to 4, and those are the elements. Now I can also see this information here by using the structure command. There are 3 commands which can often be used with objects in R: structure, summary, and length. The structure command, which is abbreviated to str, shows the information such as we've got here, the basic, what's in the object and what type it is, and so on. What you get will depend on the particular object. Now to run this, notice how the command is written. You have the command name and then in brackets the object. Now commands can also take additional bits of information, additional parameters which are separated by commas, if you need to modify the way they work. We'll see that once we start to use various commands. So I'm going to run this structure command here. And as you can see over in the console, I get the same information as I had down here in the environment pane. Now the second command, which is very useful with objects, is the summary command. That gives you summary information about the object. Again, the information you get will vary depending on what object you're looking at. Let's see what we get for this vector. So if you use a summary command on a vector, then as you can see, if it's a numeric vector, you get some various descriptive statistics, the minimum value, the maximum, first quartile, third quartile, and the median and mean. If you run that command on other objects like matrix and so on, data frame, you'll get different type of information. It will be information appropriate to the particular object. The third command I want to mention is length. This tells you how many elements are in the object. So running length here on X tells me, of course, that there are 4 elements. Notice, in fact, that each of these 3 commands has actually returned a value, some information, which can be stored in a variable itself. So I could have used the assignment operator to store the results of running these commands into an object, into a variable, which can then be used later on. As I mentioned in the video on key concepts, all commands in R are essentially functions, that they take input and they return a value, which can be stored in a variable. Let's now look at how to refer to the various individual elements of a vector, what's known as subsetting or filtering. Now, the basic way you refer to an element of a vector is by using its index in brackets. So if you look here we have X, and then in square brackets a number 1. What that says is print out the first element of the vector X, of the object X. So if I run this, obviously I should get 1.2, and there we are. Now, in fact, so that's returned, in fact, a vector. Notice the number 1, a single component element vector with 1.2. So I could again have assigned the result of this, running this command, into a variable itself. Now that shows how to show one particular element. If I want to show a subset of elements, of more than one, I can use this notation here. So notice this command here is X, and in square brackets 3:4. That tells me that will show or print the elements 3 and 4, from 3 to 4. So it should give me these final 2 here, which it does. Again, it's returning a vector, so I could store that into another variable as a vector. Now, if you want to return all the elements except 1, you use this notation here. So X, and in brackets -2, says return all the elements of X apart from the second one. So this should give me 1.2, 5.6 and 10, which it does. And the final way of subsetting or filtering a vector is to use some condition within the square brackets. So here, as you can see, I'm asking it to return the values of X, but only those where the values within X are greater than 4. So to use the conditioning here, you put the name of the variable, obviously of the object, and in brackets you put some condition, such as here, X greater than 4, or you could have put X greater than equal to 3, or X less than 2, and so on. Again, obviously, with a numeric vector, we're going to be using a condition like this, which specifies some arithmetic condition. So this should, of course, return the values of X where they're greater than 4, which again should be the last 2, which is what we get. It obviously doesn't return 1.2 and 3.4. Again, it's returning a vector, as is shown by this, the 1 at the start here, so that could be stored in a variable. Now let's look at some of the operations you can do with vectors. That showed you how to subset, how to choose particular elements only. So what I'm going to do first of all is create another vector y, another numeric vector y with those elements, 4 elements. Now with vectors, with numeric vectors, you can of course do numeric operations, arithmetic operations, so you can add 2 vectors together. So what I've got here is a line which will add x plus y and store that in z. Now, just like operations on vectors in matrix algebra, it will add individual elements together that are in the same position. So this will add the first value in x to the first value in y, the second value in x to the second value in y, and so on. So that creates z. Notice that doesn't print over here because I've simply stored it. If I want to show what's in z, I need to print it by typing z. And so we get this vector here. Now if you check, of course, the first element should be 4.5 plus 1.2, which is 5.7. The second element is 2.5 plus 3.4, which is 5.9, and so on. So it's adding them element by element. That was addition of vectors. Now let's try multiplication. So here I'm going to multiply x and y together and store the value in a vector, an object called h, a variable h. Now let's print this out. And we get a 4-element vector. So notice that multiplication here is not the same as multiplying vectors in matrix algebra in the sense that you get the inner product. For that you need to use a special operator, which we'll come on to in a later video when we look at linear algebra. What this does is it just like with addition, it multiplies element by element. So in other words, when we say multiply x times y, it multiplies the first element in x by the first element in y, and that gives me the first element in h. The second element in x is multiplied by the second element in y, and that gives me the second element in h, and so on. You can probably most easily see that if you look at the fourth element here, 10 and 2.2, or 10 times 2.2 is obviously 22, and there we have it. So remember that multiplication of vectors in R is not finding the inner product. Now you can apply various other arithmetic functions, mathematical functions to vectors. For example, here I'm going to use the mean function on x, so that will obviously find the mean of the values in x, which is 5.05. Again, I could have stored that, I could have assigned that to a variable, but I've simply printed out the results here. Okay, the final thing to look at in terms of basic vector operations is how to add and delete elements. Sometimes you want to add additional elements to a vector, and sometimes you want to delete elements. Now the way you add elements is using this notation. Here I'm going to add an additional element to vector x, the one I created here, by multiplying x and y together. So I'm going to use the standard notation for creating a vector, and what I'm going to say is create a vector which contains what's currently in h, and then a comma, and another element 33. So that should add 33 onto h. So here's h, so it should add another, it should be the same elements plus 33 at the end. So let's try that. And as you can see, that's what happened. It's those 4 elements as before with 33 added. So that's how you add an additional element to an existing vector. Now what about deleting elements? Well, here is the way to do that, using a similar notation as we did here for subsetting, where here I excluded everything. I excluded value 2. Here I want to exclude values 2 to 3, so the second and third values. So what I'm doing here is I'm removing values elements 2 and 3 from vector y, which and then I'm reassigning to y. So this, if we look at y here, this should remove 2.5 and 3.6 and just leave me with 4.5 and 2.2. Let's try it. So let's print out y, and indeed that's what we get. It's removed the second and third and just left me with 4.5 and 2.2 as being vector y now. Okay, so that shows you how to use vectors and some of the basic operations that you can do in R.